I don't think there's any doubt that Russia's position, or I should say Russia, I should say the Putin regime's position is difficult because they can't really afford the war. The economy is stumbling and it could get much worse. Uh, while Putin's been able to bribe people to serve as soldiers in Ukraine, they've also had to manipulate and deceive global southers, to come and fight in Ukraine under false pretenses. And it's well understood, especially among the most hawkish members of Russian society, that the war is not going well.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today on day, I think it's 1,430 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're very fortunate to be talking to former US Ambassador John Herbst. Now, Ambassador Herbst, a senior director of the Eurasia Centre at the Atlantic Council, a career diplomat for over 30 years and served as the US Ambassador to Ukraine between 2003 and 2006, I believe, and that was during the Orange Revolution. And you've been ambassador to Uzbekistan as well. So you're a leading US-Russia expert and a vocal advocate for strong Western support for Kyiv. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back to Frontline.
My pleasure.
Now, there's a lot going on at the moment, it seems, and Davos has been front and center of it. Ukrainian delegation is heading to the United Arab Emirates for trilateral talks with both the US and Russian officials. I think this is the first time in a while that they've all got together, and Putin seems to have signed up for POTUS's Board of Peace, yet is still attacking Kyiv with ballistic missiles. Is this yet another example of Putin playing Trump? And do you expect there to be any real progress in this meeting in the UAE?
Putin thus far has shown zero willingness to compromise. And Zelensky has accepted every proposal Trump has put on the table since March. But Putin does not want to annoy Trump. He is afraid of American power. So he jollies Trump, says he's brilliant. He signed up, but did not really sign up for the Board of Peace. Because while he says, yes, I'm in, he'll pay his $1 billion dues from the frozen Russian assets. So those dues are not coming anytime soon. Because Putin feels he can get away with something like that with Trump. I'm sorry to say that. Over time, I think that will not work for Putin. But so far, he's done okay avoiding Trump's anger, even though he is the one blocking Trump's efforts to achieve a durable peace.
It's interesting, but as part of that durable peace, one of the things that's critical, and there's been a lot of negotiations around, are security guarantees. And this is something where President Zelensky has said, he's got to a point where he feels comfortable with what the US are saying. But that was before POTUS came out with the statements saying that, at Davos, saying that he didn't think that other NATO nations would come to the US's support. Yet the only time Article 5 has been called is by the United States after 9/11, and NATO nations rallied round to a complete nation. And then last night he turns around and insults allied nations by saying that they fought a little off the front line. And there are a large number, 457 British families who would strongly disagree, having lost people in the front line, another 2,200 British troops who were severely injured. If POTUS is coming out with these sorts of statements, how can Zelensky trust anything that he says with regard to security guarantees?
Well, I understand your point. And certainly Trump unjustly characterized the actual heroic efforts of our allies in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And Trump also did not acknowledge that, in fact, the one time Article 5 was called into action was to protect the United States following the terrorist attacks on 9/11. So we see that sometimes President Trump presents ideas which he sees as helpful to whatever policy objective he has, even if those ideas don't have much connection with what actually happened. This is simply his persona. But if Trump makes a commitment on security guarantees, especially if they wind up being ratified by the Senate, and there are serious Republicans as well as Democrats in the Senate talking about this. I think the danger you point to is not zero, but I don't think it's overwhelming.
Well, that's very reassuring. But then when it comes to giving doses of reality, President Zelensky gave one himself at his speech at Davos. He was talking of the Greenland mode accusation, and he accused European leaders of being in Greenland mode, paralyzed and waiting for President Trump's next move rather than acting themselves, and criticized them as effectively paper tigers in talking an awful lot about spending in defense and investing in it, but not actually doing it. Is he right? Is Europe still trying to abrogate responsibility for wider European defense to Washington?
His speech yesterday was somewhat controversial. There were a largish number of people in Davos who said, yes, you're absolutely right, President Zelensky, and there are others who said, no, that was not fair. Let me split this right down the middle. I think we've seen serious efforts by Europe since that dreadful Oval Office meeting between Zelensky and Trump, February 28 of last year, to take on responsibilities for security and supporting Ukraine. New responsibilities. They've made serious and positive efforts. But those efforts have not been enough. In that sense, Zelensky's right. And I would point to two things in particular. The quote unquote easier one is the frozen Russian money, right? I applauded the decision taken by Europe late last year to provide a $90 billion loan to Ukraine on the basis of those frozen assets. But the strong measure that was necessary and is still necessary would be to make the decision that most of those assets start to head their way directly to Ukraine. That would be a very clear indication to Putin that Europe is going to be truly tough. So that's point one. Point two, and this criticism can be addressed at the United States as well as in Europe. It's crystal clear that even putting the Russian aggression in Ukraine on the side, which we should not, but if we just did that hypothetically, Europe and the United States face a major danger from both Russia and China. And our arms at present are not sufficient to meet that danger. There's been good talk on both continents, Europe and North America, about greatly increasing defense spending and actually producing the arms. But not that much is done. Some, but not that much. If suddenly Germany were to reach a deal with Ukraine and produce millions of drones on the Ukrainian model, announce that would get Putin's attention in ways that might persuade him to negotiate a compromise peace. And ditto if the United States did something comparable, not just with Ukrainian drones. If the United States were to do what Trump was pondering in the mid-fall of sending hundreds, if not thousands, of Tomahawks to Russia. If I were making policy, I would announce that the next time Russian drones and ballistic missiles hit a Ukrainian city, we're going to dispatch 500 Tomahawks to Ukraine. And if it continues, more of that. That might persuade Putin that he should stop this inhumane war and negotiate a compromise peace.
So with these talks that are going on in the UAE, it's almost certain, and I think we probably agree on this, that the Russians are going to come up with nothing of any substance whatsoever. It's just going to be flannel. How long do you think President Trump is going to withstand this flannel that keeps coming out from Putin before he actually takes some form of decisive action and recognizes that Putin's the aggressor?
It's a great question. And it's a question that I've been talking about, not just me. I would call the minority school of Western analysts who believe that Russia is not going to be given Ukraine by Trump. That's not going to happen. We're wondering, when will Putin step over that line? And what we've witnessed, it's really not surprising at all to those of us who see this. We've been talking about this for over a year, how Trump has jumped back and forth between blaming Putin, blaming Zelensky, threatening actions against Putin, then not threatening actions, and then actually taking some actions. I mean, after all, Trump deserves credit for the sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil taken in late-ish October. But it's clear he's reluctant to do that. It's clear he doesn't think that's the way to treat Putin, when that's the only way Trump will achieve his goal. So eventually he will answer the question he himself has posed: is Putin playing me? And answer it yes, and now it's time for me to do something about it. But I'm not certain when that time is going to be.
Do you think, therefore, that the use of Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who really don't have a huge amount of diplomatic experience, but are coming at things from a wider business perspective, are helpful as part of the negotiating team and setting things up? Or do you think that the wily old Putin is just smiling because he knows that these are people that he can potentially manipulate, and therefore it's just elongating everything?
Witkoff has taken a lot of criticism, and I think much of that criticism is understandable. And certainly he did not look good when he was being interviewed in Davos, and he refused to call out the Russians for their massive bombing of Ukrainian civilians, infrastructure, hospitals, and such, simply dismissing it as part of war. But having said that, it's not critical who Trump sends to Moscow to talk to Putin. It's critical what Trump does. So, yes, send Witkoff, that's fine. But then send those tomahawks to Ukraine, right? And then you took the strong steps on Rosneft and Lukoil. There are other Russian energy assets that could be sanctioned. Although also you have to credit Trump lately, although this is more an offshoot of our policy in South America, for going after the oil tankers, the Russian oil tankers. I think at this point we've seized, I don't know, is it 7 or 8 or 9 Russian oil tankers, the shadow fleet.
Yes, we're starting to see the Europeans doing the same. But again, this ties back into what Zelensky was saying in his speech. Do you think that the tone that he took was one that, in a way, it sort of echoed what President Trump's been saying, and therefore Zelensky took the tone to try and back up Donald Trump, so that he would try and suggest that he was on Donald Trump's side more, with European leaders knowing full well where Zelensky was coming from. And actually, in a way, he's right, because we're not seeing sufficient investment in defence. We're seeing an awful lot of bluff. And I can say that from a United Kingdom perspective, in what our government is saying and what they're actually doing and everything else. And it is time that people give European leaders a wake-up call.
I understand why especially European analysts would come to that conclusion as to what Zelensky was trying to do. I don't rule that out, but there's at least one other factor. I think that Zelensky is tired, understandably, of all the plaudits he gets with not nearly enough muscle, right? I mean, I was in Munich in February of 22 at the security conference, a week or so before the big invasion, and everyone was applauding him to the skies. But, where was the aid, right? And, we saw the great German Zeitenwende under Scholz, which turned out to be a joke. Although Merz is serious. Merz deserves serious praise. And for that matter, by and large, the UK has been certainly better than the United States since the big invasion, especially Johnson and the Tories. But Starmer, I give him credit too. Although I agree with you, they've got to up the game on defense spending and arms production.
No, it's interesting to see. But if you're sitting in your position in Kyiv, if it was currently, what would you be expecting to be being fired at you from the Ukrainians, and what would you be whispering back into the diplomatic circles to get into the White House as to the way forward and keep this balance going?
Zelensky, I believe, since his tactical errors in the Oval Office back in February, has gotten a very good sense as to what he needs to do to try and pull Trump in the right direction and to stop him from heading in the wrong direction. Putin thought when Trump returned to the Oval Office that he had unique influence over him. But the Europeans, by their constant, and I would say also tactically very smart engagement with Trump over the past 9 or 10 months, and Zelensky too, post-Oval Office meeting, have blunted much of Trump's influence. Otherwise, you never would have had those sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil. The problem is they blunted much of it, but not all of it. And I think it's safe to say that Dmitriev has charmed his way into the good graces of Witkoff and maybe now Kushner, doing with them what Putin does with Trump. And that may be one of the reasons, though not the only one, we've not seen the strong, consistent American policy that Putin's obstructionism should have produced, certainly by late spring of last year.
Well, yeah, interesting, and where that's going. But at the end of the day, with everything that's going on in Ukraine, we focus on that. We often take our eyes off the ball as to what's actually happening inside Russia itself. And the one thing that Putin has been consistent on is wanting to be given the whole of the Donbass region as part of any peace settlement because he can't capture it militarily. And he's hurting economically. Do you think we actually understand just how bad a position Russia is in at the moment, and how desperate do you think Putin might be?
I don't think there's any doubt that Russia's position, or I should say Russia, I should say the Putin regime's position is difficult because they can't really afford the war. The economy is stumbling, and it could get much worse. While Putin's been able to bribe people to serve as soldiers in Ukraine, they've also had to manipulate and deceive global southers, to come and fight in Ukraine under false pretenses. And it's well understood, especially among the most hawkish members of Russian society, that the war is not going well. I mean, you'd think that Western experts on Russia who say Putin will inevitably win this war because Russia is much larger, has a much larger economy and such, pay no attention to General Ivashev, retired General Ivashev, the so-called Voyenkuri, the war bloggers, who've made the point, as Ivashev has, as has Girkin Strelkov, who's been in jail for 2+ years now, that the Russians have made no gains of strategic or even operational significance in eastern Ukraine since the Ukrainian successful counteroffensive of 2022. Right? How many times and for how many months did they announce the taking of Bakhmut before they finally took it last year? And they've claimed it had Pokrovsk twice in the last 3 months. And they don't have Pokrovsk. They don't have Kupiansk. The Ukrainians have just taken back Kupiansk. So Putin's circumstances are not easy. And he has one problem Zelensky does not. The Ukrainian people are all in for this war because they know if they don't win this war, their survival as an independent Ukrainian people is toast.
How much more do you think the Russian people can take?
Compared to the Ukrainian people, they're not suffering very much, but they're not doing it to save their identity and their independence. The short answer is we don't know. I think it's safe to say, though, that had Prigozhin not turned around when he was 100 miles south of Moscow, we might have found out. Because it's worth remembering, when Prigozhin appeared in Novorossiysk, and it was clear he was not listening to the great leader, Putin, people were cheering him in the streets. And there was no significant kinetic response to Prigozhin coming from the Russian military, the special services. Why he turned around is one of those great mysteries. There's been speculation about it. The point is, you saw then that if Prigozhin had marched on Moscow and taken the city, Putin might be in his historical Dunbin right now. And most people before Prigozhin marched spoke of Putin as rock solid. Now that was stupid because even someone like me, who's not been to Russia since 2008, knew in October, November of 2022, no, 23, excuse me, Prigozhin marched in 24. My time's compressed. In any case, knew 6 or 7 months before from all the fighting in the media between Shoigu, Gerasimov, and Kadyrov on one side and Prigozhin on the other, that there were some serious cracks in the edifice of Putin's regime. Another may be developing right now. We just don't see it. But we can't count on it. We cannot count on it.
Well, from my perspective, I think watching it, I think Prigozhin shocked himself as to how far he managed to advance. He expected to be stopped somehow or other long before he got, and therefore he just stopped outside Moscow, not knowing what to do next, and going, right, I need to negotiate for my life. That didn't go very well for him. But it's interesting that the shocks that there are amongst the regime. Putin is the Tsar in charge of everything, the kingpin holding it all together. But as his oligarchs that are underpinning him are coming under more and more pressure, and their ability to continue to operate globally. And now that Shadow Fleet tankers are being hit and everything else, and generals are being assassinated inside Moscow, and the Ukrainians are attacking Russian oil infrastructure and the economy. Do you think the Ukrainians have got their tactics right in hitting at this operational level rather than continuing to try and just win from a tactical perspective?
I don't think there's any question that this is a very smart move. And this is one plus about Trump, which gets forgotten. He has said nothing to the Ukrainians about stopping us. And remember that Jake Sullivan was dispatched by Biden to Kyiv to tell him to knock it off. And the Ukrainians, to their credit, told him to take a hike. So this is a very smart policy. And going after Russian generals and other Russian war criminals demonstrates how effective special services are in Ukraine. I remember before the big invasion, I don't know, once every 6 months, even maybe more than that, there'd be a Russian assassination in Kyiv of some Ukrainian official. The Russians have been unable to do that since the big offensive, and the Ukrainians have been doing it all the time, very impressively. Not as impressive as Operation Spiderweb, but damn good work.
Yes, the Ukrainians have had a lot of success with some very audacious operations across the board. But we're now into coming to the end of the first month in 2026. We're coming into almost the start of the 5th year of this conflict, and in the same time frame, the Russians during the Second World War had pushed the Germans back from just outside Moscow to just outside Berlin. Yet they've only advanced about 45 kilometers in the eastern Ukraine, having lost a lot of what they took in their first few months. Where do you see things developing in Ukraine from a tactical perspective, in Russia from an operational strategic perspective, and then globally, where do you see the peace agreements going through 2026?
If you listen to the quote-unquote common wisdom, which was common but not wise, a few months ago, the Russians were grinding forward inevitably. Well, it hasn't been true. They've made some tiny, tiny gains in the last couple of months. But again, their flagship captures didn't turn out to be captures. Pokrovsk and Kupiansk. And, Berlin was a flagship capture. Pokrovsk is not a flagship capture. Now, it is true Ukraine has lots of empty spots on their lines. They could be doing better on mobilization, on drafting. But even without that, the Russian gains have been piddly and at extraordinary cost. I've seen numbers as high as 29-1. That strikes me as being over the top, but 10-1 not. 10-1 not. And again, those Russian war bloggers are talking about those types of numbers. So I think if Western policy becomes, as it should become, stronger, there'll be no Russian gains whatsoever. If it continues the way it is right now, the Russians may at best do what they're doing right now. But it's hard to imagine them making any breakthrough. It was clear some of the gains they made like 3 or 4 months ago came from changing their tactics, where they would infiltrate a few soldiers in and then have reinforcements come in behind. That way they avoided the attention of the Ukrainian drones. And that worked until the Ukrainians realized what was going on. And then they figured out ways to let people come in and then make sure that they got no reinforcements. And then they had to leave for no want of supplies. Or they simply were destroyed in place. So Russia has demonstrated the ability to adapt, but Ukraine continues to have the operational edge. So that's what I expect to see in the battle space. That could change for the worse if Western support diminishes. That could be in the form of the U.S. not allowing arms to be sold to their European allies to go to Ukraine. But so far, that's not happened. And that could also happen if the money dries up from Europe. But I don't think that's going to happen either. And the decision made on that loan, a month or two ago, is indication that's not going to happen. And globally, if the war on the Shadow Fleet continues the way it's been going since Venezuela, that's that much faster the Russian economy's pressure could lead to something significant. But again, it's very hard to tell when that point of significance comes.
If Ukraine in any sort of peace deal is forced to give up any territory, and I include Crimea as part of that, and given the rhetoric that's come out from President Trump with his, I want to own Greenland, and now he's backed down from that. We don't know the detail of what any deal is that's in there. But what sort of message do you think that's sending to Xi Jinping over Taiwan?
Well, of course, people in Russia and China and other authoritarian spaces all talked about the quote unquote hypocrisy of the United States and the West as Trump was talking away about Greenland. And I hate to say it, but that was not an unfair shot. But it's also true that the comparison is limited because the Russians sent soldiers into Crimea and they now control it. Trump huffed and puffed, but he did not actually try to blow the house down. So that's an important distinction. And we don't know the nature of that deal, but so far there's no indication that as a result of this episode, the United States has gotten more than it would have gotten if it just asked Denmark to begin with.
So another example of President Trump huffing and puffing. But at the end of the day, President Zelensky spoke of a dignified end to the war. But realistically, what would a dignified end look like to you?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, because I've been saying this since before Trump took office after he won the election, Trump's goal is a durable peace, right? Not a just peace. And he's always spoken about, or rather his team, for months before our election, 2024, were talking about the elements of such a deal that included roughly an ending to the fighting along the current lines. That included massive armament of Ukraine to deter further aggression. That included European troops on the ground in Ukraine to deter further aggression. And it's amazing how we've seen those ideas crystallizing in the negotiations between the US and Ukraine. And of course, but you have to add to that mix something Zelensky annoyed Trump with in the Oval Office, which was security guarantees. And to Zelensky's credit, he got Trump to offer security guarantees when they met in Florida 4 weeks ago. So those are the outlines of a deal. The only problem, of course, is they're unacceptable to Putin because Putin wants control of Ukraine. And even Trump has acknowledged that may be Putin's objective. Of course it's his objective. But Zelensky, in more or less agreeing to these terms a while back, was signaling he would accept a deal which leaves Russia in occupation of Ukrainian territory, but only on a de facto basis. And he has pushed back hard, and many American foreign policy experts have pushed back hard against the notion of recognizing de jure Russian aggressive control of Ukrainian land.
And finally, do you think if Vladimir Putin is given any concessions whatsoever, and include territorial concessions in that, he will then just use that to go and lick his wounds, learn the lessons from what went wrong in this part of this phase of the battle in Ukraine, and then come back for another salami slice at some stage in the future, whether it be Putin or Putin 2, whoever takes over from him in the future?
I don't have any doubt that that's what's on Putin's mind now. And conceivably, he would agree to a deal if Ukraine, foolishly, at American insistence, gave Putin those fortified positions in western Donbass that his troops have been unable to take. And frankly, since Trump is offering Zelensky security guarantees, that's foolish for American forces, because we'd have to deal with the results of Russia's military in a much greater position in Ukraine. So Putin's not going to get that.
On that note, I hope Steve Witkoff and President Trump are listening, because it's giving them real insights as to the reality of what they should be doing and what would happen in the future. But Ambassador John Herbst, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today once again on Frontline.
My pleasure. Thank you.